Coach, I learned a lot from Dr. Ben today about what it really means to be a leader worth following.
And I thought what he talked about trust with the three keys for a leader. One, are you competent? Two, are you a person of integrity? And three, how do you make decisions that are beneficial for the team and not just you?
Let's get into the episode.
This is the Limitless Leadership Lounge, where Coach and John learn along with you from some of the world's most decorated leaders. Recently promoted, let's sharpen the saw together.
I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Ben Granger. And let me share a little bit about Ben. Ben is a chief workplace psychologist at Qualtrics and has over 15 years experience building, running, and optimizing experience management programs across hundreds of global organizations. His research has been published in academic and business media, including CNBC, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. He has earned his doctorate in industrial organization psychology from the University of South Florida. And now, from Louisiana, let's welcome to the Limitless Leadership Lounge, Dr. Ben Granger.
Oh, thanks, guys. I really appreciate y'all having me.
Awesome. We're really looking forward to it. And I do want to mention Ben's book here, A Leader Worth Following. I read the book and it was a terrific read. I highly recommend it, and I'm sure we'll delve into it. In fact, we're going to delve right away because one of the things you brought up in the book early, and I had heard it, but reinforced because I hadn't thought too much about it, is the acronym VUCA. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how leaders can handle VUCA?
Yeah, the VUCA acronym is something not everybody's familiar with, but everybody's definitely familiar with the themes, and it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And essentially, it represents the external environment that we're operating in. And basically, not that long ago, maybe a couple decades ago, in the Army War College, they coined that phrase to describe the environment in which combat troops were operating, but also that is equally relevant to organizations. And it was about 10 years ago now. I was at an academic conference for organizational psychologists, and I was attending a session that was being put on by some experts at Google. And that was the first time I had to come across that VUCA acronym. But what dawned on me as I was doing some writing in the book was when in 2016, when I was sitting there getting introduced to this acronym, I was just sitting there like vigorously nodding away. Yes, it is crazy right now. Things are moving so fast. It's so ambiguous right now. We don't know what's going to happen next. That was the whole point of the presentation. And yet, fast forward to today, and how much more nutty is it? It's just exponentially crazier. And so that led me to this thought around, if we were to ask ourselves, are we in a VUCA environment now? To me, that's an inherently relative and subjective question. And I would bet that it's inherently subjective in that we're the ones who decide whether it's VUCA or not. And it's inherently relative because the way our human minds work is there's always some standard against which we compare the current state, and that's the past. And so is it crazier and more volatile and uncertain today than it was yesterday? Yeah, there's no question about it. So this perennial, we're in a perennial VUCA environment, and that's not going to slow down.
Yeah. So, how do leaders handle, for one thing, let's just start with volatility?
It is extraordinarily challenging. That's the first thing I'll say. That's an obvious statement, but I think it's important to recognize that all leaders and organizations and communities are faced with this challenge. But one of the things that I have seen leaders do, I think this is the wrong approach. What I'll start with is going all in on what the new shiny thing is. Today, that's AI.
Right.
I'm not suggesting we not focus on AI. I'm not suggesting we not focus on what's coming next. Maybe quantum computing is a good candidate, but we do need to understand that. But the problem is going all in on that and forgetting that humans are the ones who have to operate in this environment. And so my general suggestion is that in order for leaders and groups of people to succeed in VUCA environments, They have to both understand the new technologies and the forces that are driving that, certainly, and they need to focus on how humans respond to those environments. And to put it quite simply, when humans are in an uncertain environment, what that means is our brains are not able to predict what's going to happen. And when the human brain can't predict what's going to happen or can't create a coherent story, we get really unpleasant feelings. And we get that dissonance that we're all familiar with. When we get that dissonance, we're heavily motivated to relieve ourselves of that. And so we do weird things, we make weird decisions. And so the first tip I give leaders is because we're in a perennial VUCA environment, you got to give people more grace. You have to understand that this is how people are going to respond. They're going to respond negatively, at least at first. The second big tip is you want to communicate more. And this is something we've learned through our research at Qualtrics is during times of ambiguity and uncertainty, that's sometimes when leaders pause communications
Mhm.
because, oh, we don't have time for that. Okay, but if you redefine your group or your organization or your community as we're a group of people who are trying to work toward a shared mission, I pose this rhetorical question all the time. When you put a group of people trying to work together to achieve a shared mission, and you put that group of people in a highly volatile or uncertain complex environment, should they talk more or less? The answer is abundantly obvious when we reframe it that way. They need to talk more.
Right.
And so over communication and higher fidelity communication, I think is really the key there.
Ben, I do a lot of leadership presentations around the country. And one of the questions I always ask, and you brought it up in the book, and I'm curious because we want to help all leaders, but young and emerging leaders is our main, is I ask, is trust important in building a great team? And I get always 100% hands. But then I kind of shock them because I talk about building an intentional trust plan. But I'm curious if you were working with a young leader that just took over, how would you, what advice would you give them? Two or three tips on building trust because we know it's essential, but often we don't do a very good job with it.
That's such a good point, Coach, because I find the same thing. We do a lot of research on trust, and I find everybody agrees that it's important. And yet, if we walked around the room and we asked people, well, how do I do this a lot in the workshops I run, is I ask people, are you trustworthy? Should you be? And basically 98% of people raise their hands. Right? So of course we are. And what's fascinating is when I ask people why, they list out very logical reasons because I do this and I show up this way and I don't do these things, and therefore people should trust me. So they build a very logical, rational argument as to why people should trust them, why they're trustworthy. And yet, when we look at the research on trust, it is far more emotional than rational. And so, in other words, that old saying, people won't remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. There's a
Right.
lot of truth to that.
Yeah.
So for those young leaders, especially those ones who are go-getters, I've led many leaders like this, coached many leaders like this, and they want to just rush to solving the problem.
Yeah.
And that's understandable. I was guilty of that too. So one of my biggest tips, and this comes directly from the research on trust, is spend time just really getting to know people. And there was a great study that was done by the business consultants, Jack Zanger and Joe Folkman. They looked at 80,000 360 assessments of employees rating their leaders. And
Okay.
what they wanted to know was what was it about that relationship that people have with their formal leaders that drives them to either trust or not trust? And the number one factor that emerged was that there was some degree of a personal, intimate relationship between the leader and the employee. Sometimes it's that simple. It's just really getting to know, spend some time on site with people in person, just getting to know each other. The second big tip I would offer, again, comes from our research on what drives both consumers to trust brands they do business with, what drives employees to trust their leaders. One of the biggest factors that leaders fall short on is a subcategory of trust called benevolence.
Mm.
And essentially, when we ask employees, hey, do you trust your leader? We ask them to look through three different lenses. Do you think your leader is competent? Do they have the skills to do what they need to do? All right, check that box. Do they have integrity? In other words, do they do what they say they're going to do? Are they consistent? Okay, check that box. And by the way, two-thirds to three-fourths of global employees agree with those first two. But then you ask them the third lens to look through. When your leaders make decisions, what's the motive? Are they just pursuing another dollar? Are they just out for themselves? Are they doing it for the benefit of the group? And that's where you see employees and consumers drop off big time. Only about half of global employees say that their leaders make decisions, they perceive that their leaders make decisions for the betterment of the group. And
Mhm.
so that I think is goes back to that personal relationship for a young leader just starting out. It's really critical, especially early on in the relationship with the people you lead, to show them why you're doing what you're doing. And by the way, it should be for the group's benefit. It can't just be about, hey, we have this profit margin target we got to hit. If that's all what it's about, you're going to lose people and you're going to have a harder time hitting those metrics, ironically.
It's interesting when I evolved and I feel like I became a better leader is when I started to ask more questions and
Yes.
became a better listener. But the interesting thing is I really wanted to get input from both my staff and my players. But at the same time, if I didn't think it was something that was feasible, I would always say, I really appreciate your input, but this is the reason I don't think it is in the benefit of the team. And they may not agree, but at least they knew where I was coming from. And I think that helped build trust immensely. So I appreciate what you're saying.
I love those points. Just to add to it, I think real leaders ask more questions than give answers.
Okay.
And they, especially early on, asking someone a question, especially someone who's lower in rank than you, is a very small but powerful show of vulnerability. And it
Yeah.
says, there's something that I don't.
Yeah.
That's very powerful. And that vulnerability drives trust. And then I love your point too about sometimes the leader, because I help organizations collect feedback from employees. And one of the questions I get is, what if they give bad advice or bad suggestions or stuff we can't do? And my advice is very similar to what you do, Coach Jim, is you don't have to do everything people say.
Right.
But what you do need to do is explain why you made the decision. And sometimes in the literature, we call that procedural justice. Maybe you don't like the outcome of my decision, and that's okay. But here's why I made the decision, and here's my objective, here's my motive. And
Right.
even if people are upset with the decision, that's going to soften the blow significantly. I love that advice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sounds like intention matters a lot, Dr. Ben. And let's talk about leaders from your past because clearly you've seen some good leadership examples, you've seen some bad leadership examples. Let's start with a leader that you've had in your life, whether it be personal or professional, who you consider to be a leader worth following. Why were they a leader worth following?
I think about one of my very first like big boy jobs I had. I was running selection assessments at Verizon. And I remember there was a woman I worked for there. Her name is Dr. Ashley Walford. And I still think I'm still very good friends with her. But she was the epitome of a leader worth following. And specifically, one of the things I just greatly admired about her was her motor. She worked
Yeah.
hard. And what I really appreciated, I remember there was some big projects that I got dumped on my lap. This was around the time when Verizon Wireless was being acquired
Mm.
by Verizon. Because Verizon Wireless used to be half owned by Vodafone.
Mm.
And then I think this was maybe 12 years ago or so, Vodafone sold their share in wireless to Verizon. And so we had this massive integration project. And I remember I'm sitting there, I'm like mid 20s, and they said, "All right, Ben, you're going to run point on the HR to get all the HR groups connected." And I'm just sitting here like deer in the headlights, like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. And I still vividly remember this one day, Ashley perceived I was very overwhelmed because I was. And she just stopped what she was doing. She rolled her chair over to mine and she goes, "Okay, I'm canceling all my meetings. Let's get to work. What do you need me to do?" And she like gave me permission to assign her work. but she was in the trenches with her sleeves rolled up. And that was just one example that's very memorable to me. That was her MO. It was all about, I'm going to dig in with you. I'm going to do the dirty work with you. We're going to get it done together. And so she always had that grounded optimism that I always seek in a leader and just the grit. So that was just, I think she was one of the standout examples in my mind.
Hey, Ben, can you share us a story of a client you worked with that obviously you don't have to bring up the client's name, but that they made a huge faux pas and how you helped them overcome that mistake?
Yes. I remember a particular example where an executive got up in front of the company. This was right after a reduction in force, a significant reduction in force. And the executive basically got up in front of the rest of the company. And the problem was the points that he was making they were overly optimistic. They did not resonate with the rest of the workforce. They didn't jive with the pain that the rest of the workforce was going through. It was like, hey, get over it. It's going to be fine. This was right for the company. It completely neglected anything about the individuals. It was
Mhm.
all about what's right for the company, which is fine, but it just didn't, it wasn't a balanced message. And it just did not resonate. And that moment, that very small moment, 15-minute talk track, a lot of trust eroded during that period. And so to come back from that, even just a 15-minute faux pas, took a lot of work and a lot of time. And it was all of it was around trust. And I worked with the executive team, not just that one executive, but I worked with that executive team to really break down. Here's what, for one, we had data on how employees felt about it. We had collected some feedback from those employees, and they were not impressed. They were like, this is completely out of touch. These executives clearly do not understand what we're going through. There was this huge rift, and the rift was growing. That's the last thing you want to do after a rift, like a reduction in force. That's the last thing you want, because you got to keep keeping on.
Right.
And so it was all the trust things we talked about earlier, Coach Jim. That was a lot of what we talked about is look, during these times, your employees do not want or need cheerleaders to get up and tell them how good things are going to be. That is not what they need right now. They do need optimism, but it must be ground. And I'm a big fan of the Stockdale paradox. I'm
Mhm.
sure you guys are familiar with that one, but for the listeners who aren't, Admiral Stockdale was the highest ranking official in the Vietnam, for I think it was 7 years in a Vietnam prisoner of war camp during the Vietnam
Right.
War. And when he was interviewed after he got out, he was asked like, what was the difference between those soldiers who literally died in that prisoner of war camp and those who got through? And he said, oh yeah, the ones who didn't make it out, they were overly optimistic. They would talk about, oh, by Easter, they're going to come and rescue us. We're going to be out of here. By Christmas, we'll be out of here. And it was just overly optimistic and it wasn't grounded in reality. And he said the difference was those of us who did make it out of, and thanks to Admiral Stockdale's leadership, they confronted the brutal reality. We are in a prisoner of war camp. It's going to be horrible, but we will get through this and we're going to get through it together. And so there's a fine line between those two things. But that was the big issue. And since then, that executive and the executive team have done a substantially better job of when the purse strings are tighter with all the changes that have happened recently. They are much better of just saying, hey, it's tough out there. We know, here's what we're hearing from you. They're reflecting back what employees are saying. But they always finish with this grounded optimism of, but we will get through this. Here's the plan. Here's what we're doing. And you should see the increase in trust scores from
Wow.
employees over that period. It took a lot of time to come back from that, but it's been dramatic.
Yeah.
It's funny what you said about what I'm hearing is the fact of empathy, really understanding where people are, and that obviously that leader didn't do a very good job. I'll tell you one real quick story that I didn't realize the power of. As much as one of my leadership principles is lead by example. During my career, I always insisted our players wear a shirt and tie when we went to a visiting school. In one game, I did not wear a shirt and tie. And when we got back to our school after the game, one of my parents called me out on it and said, Coach, you always talk
Wow.
about modeling the behavior. And I think it's just a great lesson it was a great lesson for me, and I want to share it to our listeners, is that you are always on stage. And I will say, I made the amends. I said to him, you are absolutely right. And I always wear the shirt and tie after that. So
I love
that's
that.
the power of leading by example. So go
And I
ahead, John.
think inherent in that, coach, is that parent felt comfortable enough to come and be honest with you.
Yeah,
And that's something that's hard to build too, that environment where, top-down leaders who lead with dominance and control,
yeah.
they create an environment where it's very difficult to get honesty out of people. I
Mhm.
think one thing that indicates to me is that you had this environment within your program where you were honest with each other, and kudos to you for saying, hey, you know what, I did mess up. And
Yeah,
that's what, to me, that's what real leaders do, is they own up to their mistakes and they fix it.
yeah. That's
Because they're
Yeah.
right.
going to make them. We're all going to make mistakes.
Right.
Yes, that's inevitable. Dr. Ben, it sounds like you're very grounded in research. So I'm curious if there's any research around this that you know of. Past 10 years or so, what is undeniable is a huge seismic shift in the workforce. People either leaving the workforce altogether, traditionally speaking, and going to either owning their own sole proprietorship or business or whatever, or changing jobs at a more rapid pace. That's what the research certainly undeniably says about the last decade or even longer. So tell us what you think is responsible for that. Is there any research about that, as far as, is that a leadership problem? Is that more just a workplace culture problem? Is it the individual employees? What do you think is most responsible for this shift that we're seeing?
I love this question, John, because if you were to ask that question to leaders, most of them would say, it's all these entitled employees. If you go to the employees and you ask them what it is, they'll say, oh, it's the culture. So they would all point fingers at each other.
Yep.
And we do have evidence of that, by the way. That's not just my opinion. But yes, we are seeing a lot of the same trends, John, because we do research at the global workforce regularly. We have, for example, a normative database that we use for companies to benchmark against. Today, it's got almost 32 million individual employee responses collected over the last 3 years. And it's
Wow.
going to be updated in the next month, and it's going to include 38 million.
Wow.
So it's a massive data set. And we also do regular studies outside of that data set every year. And then the most recent one we did, we went out to a sample of right under 34,000 global workers across 24 different countries, all major industries. What we were basically looking for is, hey, what's going on today? We were asking questions about VUCA, like we started. How are you perceiving it? What's going well? What's not going well? One of the things we noticed this year that really concerned us was a validation of the headlines that companies are moving to what I would call more transactional work models. And what I mean by that is a lot more gig work, a lot more what people who used to be full time are now part time. They're coming off the full time payroll. Companies don't want to pay all the benefits, for example. So they're and I think this can be a good thing for some people because it allows for more flexibility. So I'm not saying it's necessarily good or bad, but what we did notice was that when we looked at the percentage of so we had a fairly large percentage of part-time workers in our total sample. I think it was roughly 14 to 15% of our total sample identified as I'm a part-time worker. There was a very large percentage of those who were frontline workers. In other words, they work directly with customers, either over the phone, in person. So direct individual contributor working directly with customers. And I would also throw in new hires, people who have been with their company for less than a year. If you look at those three cohorts, they overlap substantially. In other words, part-time workers are mostly frontline, and most frontline part-time workers are also new hires. They move around a lot. Now, there's not complete overlap, but there's a lot. The Venn diagram, big overlapping section. And each of those cohorts individually, when we tracked, for example, how did part-time workers experience work last year compared to this year? How did frontline workers? How did new hires? All three of those experiences dropped precipitously
Hmm.
year over year. That's really concerning. And when I say precipitously, 7 to 10 point drops,
Wow.
which for any stats nerds on the listening, that is not only statistically significant, it is massively practically significant. Like with the sample size we're talking about, statistical significance is a given. A 1 point difference would have been statistically significant. We're talking double digits in some cases, massive drop. So, what this is indicating to us is as companies move toward more transactional work models away from full-time work, what they're basically doing is letting go of a loyalty. They're letting go of a long-term connection that an employee has with a group. Employees are feeling it. They're under investing in those groups, part-time workers, their frontline workers, their new hires. But and this is my argument to the hardcore business leader who's, oh, who cares? Because there are some like that. Oh, I don't care. Just I pay them and they come to work. Okay, fair. But who do those employees interact with? Your customers. Do you care about your customers and their experience? There's not a single business leader who doesn't that I've ever met. And we're also noticing, and just some slight support for this, when we went out to the frontline part-time employees and we asked them, hey, when your company messes up on customer experience, what's the cause? What do you think the causes are? Then we asked the same of executives. Hey, executives, when y'all mess up on delivering a customer experience, what's the cause? Guess which group got it right when we validated against what consumers say?
I'm thinking the frontline workers.
Yes, exactly. So this is a little bit of proof that, look, if we continue on these transactional work models and we pull away as organizational leaders from loyalty and we move to, hey, you show up, you do your job, we pay you. There's a lot, there's a bigger blast radius here. And it doesn't just stop with the employees that it's affecting. It's going to affect other employees. It's going to affect group performance, and it's eventually going to affect customers. And
Well
that's a
said.
problem.
Yeah. I got to circle back because we've talked about trust, we've talked about the power of building relationships as a leader. So I'm curious, can you give us a young leader, because it's something I really push when I talk to leaders, is having intentional one-on-one meetings.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious your thoughts on one-on-one meetings and any suggestions of 2 or 3 questions you think should be used during one-on-one meetings.
Yeah, love this because I do think meetings, especially one-on-ones, get a bad rap.
Yeah.
It's, oh, I don't got my one-on-one with my manager. But a lot of times, like with many things in the workplace, like performance management, nobody likes the performance management process. So it's like, all right, let's get rid of performance management. No, no, let's just change the way it's run. And same thing with one-to-one meetings. One-to-one meetings are essential, in my opinion. And I've been heavily influenced by my friend and colleague, fellow organizational psychologist, Dr. Stephen Rogelberg. And Dr. Rogelberg has done a tremendous amount of research. And in fact, he may be the global leading authority on the science of effective meetings.
Oh, wow.
And so he's heavily influenced my thinking about one-on-ones and how I conduct them and run them for young leaders. And I'm just going to share my personal experience. One of the things I used to do when I was younger in my career was I'd have my regular one-on-ones with my team, and then let's say a big client meeting would come up, and or a big internal meeting with my bosses would come up, and I would either move or cancel the one-on-one. And I would do that routinely. And I have to admit, and I'm not proud of this, I would often show up late. I'd be like,
Mm.
I'm busy, I'm back to back, so I'm 5 minutes late. Sorry, I'm late. I'm still guilty of that today to some degree. But what Dr. Rogelberg's work made me really think about is what signal does that send to the employee? And it's not a good one, right? It's like this is not as important as something else. And yet, again, I like the operational definition of an organization as a group of people who are using shared resources to accomplish a shared mission. What could be more fundamental than communication between a leader and the employee? The
Yeah.
group of people really communicating effectively, building a shared mental image of the work and what they need to do and how they need to work together. That is just so fundamental to how our organizations operate and should operate, that I would really encourage young leaders to take the one-on-ones that they hold with their employees and move it up wherever it is in your priority list of things, move it up a couple of notches.
Yeah.
Sure, there are things that may come up that are emergencies that need to supersede, but wherever it is on your list, move it up a couple notches. And when you run them, and I like the way you asked this question, Coach, like what questions should you ask? One of the things that I learned from Dr. Rogelberg too is the one-on-ones really should be for the employee, not for the manager to give a bunch of updates to the employee. Because you can do that through other forums. You can do that through your
Yeah.
weekly team meeting. You can do that through Slack or Teams or whatever communication platforms you use. But the one-on-one is the time for the employee to drive the agenda. And so essentially, that becomes the most important question is what do you need from me? What can I do as a leader to remove roadblocks so that you can get your work done? How can I enable you to get your work done better? And in fact, I did a large program rework. This was maybe 9 years ago with a bottling company to overhaul their performance management program. And that's precisely what we did with the one-on-one. They wanted to increase the frequency of manager and employee conversations about performance and goals. So what we did was we created both a downward assessment and an upward assessment. The employees evaluated their leader. How well is their leader removing roadblocks? Are they asking good questions? Are they helping me achieve my objectives? And that led to a forcing function that had a pretty dramatic cultural effect, that there was just a lot more conversation happening, and it really emphasized the leader's role as I'm going to help my team get their work done versus they're going to help me hit my metrics. Complete mindset shift through that forcing function of a new performance management process.
It's interesting. And you talk about a lot about the leader to team member relationship, right? And that's such an important relationship and it's built on trust. But let's talk about on the other side, because we're talking a lot about how leaders can help earn the trust of a team member. If you're a team member, maybe you're a new team member, you've been promoted to a leadership position, but you still have a lot of leaders who are watching your leadership. How do you build trust with those leaders who are higher than you on that ladder?
Yeah. Oh, I love this because this is, I love this balance part of the conversation because one of the things that often,
Oh, you got muted, Ben.
One
oh,
sec.
there we go.
There you go.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
The leaders will come back to me on when I'm coaching them is what about the responsibility of the employees? And I'm like, yes, I agree. What about that responsibility? And so I'm a big believer in everyone has a responsibility. If you're an employee, I'll just put it bluntly, I don't have a lot of patience for entitlement. I work for this company and my leader needs to do this and I'm not going to do anything. And I'm just going to sit around waiting for what I think I deserve. I frankly don't have a lot of tolerance for that. And fortunately, I haven't worked with a lot of people who behave that way. There's been a few, and they don't last long around me. So I'll say that. You have to step up. You have to show up. If you want somebody to show up for you, what's the most productive way to do that? You show up for them. And that starts to ignite this power of reciprocity. So if I think so many of us, and I'm so guilty of this, guys. I've done this so much in my past. I'm getting a lot better about it, but we might have a contentious relationship or contentious, like oh, I don't like my manager, I don't like my leaders or whatever. They're the ones who need to come to their senses. So what I'm going to do is basically nothing to solve the problem. I'm just going to go gossip and rumor and build the story in my mind about how bad my leaders are and all this kind of stuff. So I'm not going to actually do anything because, of course, I'm very rational and reasonable and I'm right and they're wrong, obviously. And so we do this to ourselves. And yet, is that what's the likelihood that's actually going to lead the leader to behave differently? very low. But if you are the one who, you know what, I'm mad, I'm upset, I'm gonna process my emotions, sleep on it a couple of nights. Okay, what's the most productive way to achieve my goal? What's my goal? Is it to be miserable? I doubt anybody has that goal. Is my goal to improve the relationship with my leader, those that are above me? Probably. So, what's the best way to do that? Wait for them to come to their senses? No, that's not going to happen. So, what you should do is step up, start busting your butt, and show them that you care, show them that you're trying. And guess what? When people see that you're trying and you're stepping up and you're kind, they're much more likely to respond in kind.
Yeah, I love that. The power of reciprocity is one thing that you brought up there, because a lot of times we think that if we treat someone, if we say give someone the silent treatment, how does that work out? Usually it bounces back right back at you. It ricochets
Exactly.
back at you. And this isn't just in leadership. This is in relationships. You say,
Ooh.
my wife, I'm not too happy with her right now. I'm just gonna give her the silent treatment or whatever. It doesn't go well. And so sometimes it's about being that
Exactly.
bigger person, taking the high road, right? Which is a cliche, but true, whether you're a leader or you're talking with your leader.
So true, John. And I can think of my past when I used to get frustrated with my wife. I would just give her the silent treatment. And then it would take about a day or two, and then she'd do it right back to me. And then I'm the one like, okay, I want to talk now. But I could have just fixed that 3 days ago by stepping up and being a man.
Yeah.
Well said. Bev, we're getting close to the end. I just want to share my gratitude. I love your insights, and we look forward to continue to grow our relationship because you got a wealth of knowledge. I do have one final question. I know John will wrap it up after that. I'm just curious if what advice would you give to a young leader that takes over where they actually have an opportunity to bring in some of their own staff? What advice would you give them to, as Jim Collins always talked about, you talked about the Stockdale principle, good to great, getting the right people on the bus and, of course, getting the right seats. So, what advice would you give to that young leader on trying to make those choices more effective?
Yeah, I think there's always one thing that we all have a bias toward is people who look and think like us. And this is a well-known bias. We see it in selection research, and there's a lot of evolutionary roots to this. I think a lot of people, and the classic example is you have a white male in the top of the business, and so they tend to hire other white guys. That's the kind of the classic example. But the same is tends to be true if you rearrange it. Like our brains are wired to view things and people that look different than us as more of a threat. And that's a hard bias to overcome. It is a critical one that we overcome because it can create some big time problems like blocking women out of leadership. Huge problem.
Right.
Blocking people of color and underrepresented. That's a huge problem. We have to get ahead of that means understanding what our brains are likely to do and learning how to overcome it. Because the great thing about our brains is we have this amazing prefrontal cortex that can override the automatic system that responds to these little cues of, oh, that person looks different than me, so I'm going to respond that way, or I'm going to hire people that are. I think that's a really important thing for a young leader to just be aware of is be aware of the biases that we're all going to be inclined to engage in and create a process of before you start thinking about who you want to hire or how you want to put the team together, think about the skills that your team needs to accomplish your objective. Map all those skills out. Those skills don't need to come in the form of one person. Especially if you have a good sized team and a big objective, you're going to need a lot of skills
Yeah.
and you're going to need little parts and pieces to bring it together. One other piece of advice, and I steal this from Laszlo Bach and his book Work Rules, is always hire people who are better than you in some capacity.
Right.
So as you're looking at those skills, you want to find if you have somebody who's just exceptional at, I don't know, communication, for example. They're just a really effective communicator. And that's important for your team because you need a network outside of your department. You want somebody who's better than you at that. And
Right.
if you need an engineer who's exceptional at coding or prompting AI, go find somebody who's better than you at that particular skill. And building a team of diverse talent. And by the way, the research shows diversity drives good group performance as long as it doesn't drive interpersonal conflict. Last tip I'll give here for those leaders. There's a one of the greatest lessons I learned in my studies. This goes all the way back to graduate school. It's one of those lessons that just stuck with me and it stayed with me was task conflict is good. Interpersonal conflict is bad. In other words, if you're infighting with your team and you're losing trust, that's not going to help you perform your collective objective. But if you get different people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, they look at the same problem through a different lens, and you get that team together and you can keep the egos out of it and you say, "Hey, we're going to debate this and we're going to disagree on this and we're going to come to the best solution." That task conflict is actually really good for decision making and it drives group performance. So, again, just to recap, I'd encourage leaders, especially young leaders, be aware of your tendencies. Don't just hire people who agree with you or look like you. That's a big mistake. Hire for diversity, not just physical diversity, but diversity of thought and experience, most importantly.
You know, one of my big epiphanies in my leadership journey, Ben, and it was hard because I had an ego like everybody else, was when I decided and realized that I did not have all the best answers. And my
Yes.
goal as a leader is to find the best answer. And it could be from one of my players, it could be from my assistant coach. And that helped immensely. But that's a hard threshold for a lot of leaders. And I really encourage young leaders to think about if you're going to try to solve problems, you don't have all the answers. That's the key. So.
Very
Yeah.
wise. I love that.
Let's talk about what young leaders will learn from your book and how they can get their copy.
I think there's a bunch of lessons. I hope Coach Jim would agree, but I included a lot of practical advice in each chapter from how to give a good handshake when you're meeting somebody for the first time. What's the best way to set up yourself for a good first impression? The correct body language to assume when you're in front of a group, when you're in a one-on-one meeting, what to do, what not to do, how to create environments that are conducive to group performance and get people excited and energized, and what environments stamp creativity and innovation out, and how to be mindful of the power of the environment. Overcoming biases. So I talk a lot about the different biases we engage in, and I give some practical tips how to overcome that. Essentially, the summary I would say is how do you hack your more primitive part of your brain by engaging the higher parts of your brain? It is hard to do sometimes, but it's also incredibly important. And by the way, going back to where we started with this discussion, because we're in VUCA environments, one of the hallmarks of how the human brain works in VUCA environments, uncertainty, volatility, whatever, they're more likely to rely on their automatic, more primitive parts.
Mm.
And yet, those are precisely the times where we need to engage the higher order parts of our brains and overcome that. So, I talk a lot about how to do that. And the last thing I would add is I talk a lot about, especially in the last chapter, which, if I may say, was my personal favorite to write and study for, was maintaining curiosity and humility and how that is so essential. I see that a lot in what you talk about, Coach Jim, and what I read your book, and I just saw a ton of that. And I admire that greatly in leaders who, yeah, sometimes the buck does have to stop with them. They hold ultimate accountability, but they're also humble and they're well aware of how much they don't know.
Right.
That to me is the ultimate sign of wisdom, is the acknowledgement that the pursuit of knowledge, yes, I'm going to continue to pursue knowledge, but I'm always aware of how little I know. And that, like you said, Coach, I don't have all the answers. And so I give some practical tips for how young leaders and even experienced leaders can deal with that and maintain that humility and that curiosity.
Oh, Dr. Ben Granger, your book is available wherever books are sold, right? And the Amazon link is down in the show notes. So you got to pick this up and become the leader that really is worth following. Again, Dr. Ben, we can't thank you enough for your time today. Thanks for coming on, sharing your insights on the Limitless Leadership Lounge. I'm excited to see where your future takes you and future books that you may have in the works. We look forward to staying in touch. So thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. This was a pleasure.